Hello there. Well, it is another Aspects of Star Wars, Episode 4, A New Hope. Orchestration issues, because I'm not just doing wind. Today I'm doing everything, basically, which is a little less manageable than just honing in on just woodwind. But I thought it would be good to sort of look at all aspects, and all aspects of the Force, all aspects of orchestration. So with this one, but I will focus on things like brass and strings and things in other ones. But I just thought this particularly, because it's reasonably short, the cue, only 30 bars, I thought, well, actually, it's probably quite good just to listen to look at all of it, and to sort of show you the sort of study that I would advise when you're doing reductions and kind of, if you want to find out a bit more about how things are orchestrated, is to sort of do this sort of work. I did attempt to do some sort of work on things like Eroica and Beethoven and things like that, because I was very interested in how the wind are scored in that particular piece, it's incredibly complicated, of course. Of course it is. I was looking at Eroica and kind of thinking about how that might be presented. So, for example, I did a bit of work on this, for example, and this is sort of the sheer detail that I think is kind of interesting to go into. So just the very first chord in Eroica, and this is just an example of kind of where I'm at, just picking little bits to see how it all fits together. Because it is complicated. So with Eroica, those three big chords at the beginning, it's an E-flat chord. What I find really interesting is the way that the amount of variety that occurs in this sort of language in a Viennese school. And I will come back to Star Wars, don't worry, I haven't sort of forgotten about it, I will come back to it. But to see how it all fits in. So here, I've put little notes. So first of all, I list the instruments themselves. So flute 1, flute 2, it's just stacked. Oboe 1, then oboe 2 and clarinet 1. So I noticed that they often share, oboe 2 and clarinet 1 often share the same notes with various chords. Then clarinet 2. And then in that same register, we've got trumpet 1, which is the shared note. Remember the oboe and clarinet. Maybe that's to do with the fact that the trumpet's blending. But maybe not, because trumpet 2 isn't blended with anything apart from... whoops, that's interesting. Those should all be B-flats, of course. So actually the trumpet 2 is blended with horn and bassoon. So maybe, the theory is that the blend is to do with trying to blend winds and the brass as well. Maybe that's something to do with it. But anyway, I'll come back to that in a minute. So flute 1, flute 2, oboe 1, oboe 2, clarinet 2. So what I find really interesting is there's only 1/5 of the chord in the weakest sounding instrument, which is flute 2. So in other words, an E-flat chord. So we've got our root, which is E-flat. We've got our third, which is G, and then our fifth of the chord is a B-flat. There's no other B-flat in that woodwind chord or brass at that point. So we've only got we've got root here. We've got 4 instruments playing the root, 5 roots in fact here, and 2 instruments playing third. So a roughly, 5-to-2 ratio basically. Here we've got just 3 roots and 1 third. So at this point we've got horn 1 and 3 and bassoon 1. We've got horn 2, which is not doubled in anywhere in the wind. And we've got bassoon 2 and the timp that's playing that note. So that's what we got in the brass and the lower wind, in other words, bassoons. And then we've also got, in this example, we've got 6 roots and 3 thirds. So we've got a violin 1 quadruple stop. And then we've got violin 2 as well, another sort of double stop. We've also got the viola there. Whoops, I keep doing that. That's really annoying. So we've got actually viola, viola, VC, and double bass as well at that point. And this one is violin 1 and violin 2. But it's interesting, just the arrangement of notes in it. Again, there's only 1/5 of the chord. And at this point, it's sort of a balance of thirds to roughly 1:2 in ratio in favour of roots. So we've got root, root there, another root there. The final note at the very top of the game is also a root. It's not the third. And also if we then sort of put them together as well, we've got that note which is blended with the oboe. We've also got that note which is also there. We've got this note which fills in the gap not played anywhere in the wind or the brass. And then we've got the E flats which are blended with the trumpets and the horns and the bassoon. And then we've got this note which is blended with just horn 2 and nothing else. And then we've got this level which is the bassoon 2 and the timp, the viola, the cello, and the double bass. All of that just for one chord. But I was just sort of interested to see how it's voiced. And it was noticeable that there's very few B flats in the whole thing. In fact, I think just 2 in all of those instruments, which is interesting and perhaps significant. So the next thing is later on the piece, so by bar 26. So this chord here. So it's that sort of diminished 7th chord. So if I just sort of put it in root position, we would have an E flat, then a G flat, A, and then a C at the top. But of course they're equidistant, so you know what's root and what's not, basically. Well, if we just go with the lowest sounding note, which is G flat, the next A is just one of those A's. So it's sort of missing out that third. Well, not quite, but basically there's a lot of space here, and then there's quite a lot of closed position, and then there's a bit of a gap at the top as well. And I've noticed that a lot with sort of Beethoven, basically. So bit of a gap there because there's no C. So it doesn't do that. It's all a sort of mixture of open position and a little bit of closed position as well. So we got pretty much stacks. Flute 1, flute 2, oboe 1, again oboe 2 and clarinet sharing the same note. Clarinet 2, bassoon 1, bassoon 2. Then we've got, the bassoons drop out, by the way, and then we've got this sort of melodic idea of clarinets with flute 1, flute 2, oboe 1, oboe 2, again stacked. And then more stacking at this point as well. So we've got flute 1 and flute 2 on the top note at the root. The 5th is played by oboe 2. The 3rd of the chord is played by, oboe 1. The 3rd of the chord is played by oboe 2. Root is clarinet 1. 5th is clarinet 2. Bassoon is the 3rd of the chord, and bassoon 2. And then we have a different note at that point as well. Then by bar 35, we've got no 5th in the chord. So no F there. And in fact, done the same mistake again. So a sort of B flat 7 chord. So we should have a B flat, D, F, and an A flat. So here we've got no 5th in the chord. We've got 2 roots, 4 thirds. So a lot of Ds. And then 2 7ths. So it's a really intriguing sort of balance of sounds at this point. And again, you know, flute 1, flute 2, oboe 1, oboe 2 and clarinet 1 share the same voice. Clarinet 2, bassoon 1, bassoon 2. By the way, the oboe 2 and the clarinet 1 sharing the same voice doesn't always occur, and there's continuous variety in the way that these are sort of done. Basically, it's almost seems that the orchestration comes from the variety of coloration that you can get within a very small, within a reasonably small group. Horns are very widely spaced as well, which is again very dissimilar to the way that John Williams writes, for example. But of course, this is sort of Viennese stuff at this point. And then we only have the fifth in the bass as well. So the lowest sounding note is this, and so all of that. So I wonder whether there's so many thirds in order to sort of then balance out the bottom note of that chord, because here we have the seventh in the top voice in the horns, which sort of fills in that little space here. The F around here, we have nothing whatsoever. That's just completely left blank. In other words, that doesn't that F here on the top line isn't sounded or iterated anywhere else. And it's things like that which are really interesting, and it's only by spending hours and hours and hours and hours just looking at 3, 4, 5 bars that you can kind of begin to start learning how it's all done. That is the sort of level of detail that is sort of interesting. Now, with the Destruction of Alderaan 6M5, we've got a sort of really interesting bit as it goes along, because we've got something which I don't know whether it was a mistake or because I haven't seen the sketch, but basically the celeste plays different notes to the flutes. So it sounds like this. That, and I don't know whether that was I'm sure it's deliberate, but it's a really interesting thing. So when you sort of then put it into a short score, it's very similar. So we've got this sort of fourths idea in the flutes at that point, but then the actual pitch of the celeste is just doing triads, whereas is in the flutes. I think that's actually quite unusual. I mean, obviously, in terms of the doubling, they're exact unison doublings. Of course, the celeste sounds an octave higher, which is why it's written like that. But of course, that is this, well, it would be that pitch, basically, an E flat up there. So I find that sort of interesting, and that is quite common, flutes and celeste as a sort of technique. Even more uncommon, though, is the fact that we've got a high wire in the violins, which is just first and seconds playing that G, which is quite high. Let's see if we can hear it. It's not that obvious on here. It's just a little hint. And it's really interesting, isn't it, that we've got that G, sort of minor ninth, the sort of, forbidden interval, basically. But it's so far apart, and because there's so much interest going on elsewhere, we don't really notice it. But of course, the G's already present in the fact that we've got this sort of, oscillation between G and F sharp, and we've got F sharp in the bass. So we've got that minor ninth already there. We've got horns. It would just be horn 1 on the top note and horn 2 and 3 in the bottom note. I don't know what the theory is behind that. I'd be interested again to sort of find out why that is the case. Is it something to do with playing more the fundamentals so you get a harmonic? But I've seen it the other way around as well, where the top note's doubled. So I don't know. It's a big pedal, so I suppose it makes sense for that to happen. So in the short score, you'll notice that I'm sort of just having a look at this as well. So I'm trying to make notes. Let's get rid of that Beethoven thing at that point. Trying to make notes as we go along. So things that I find important, I try and jot down. I didn't deem that important enough to bother jotting down, but when we get to this bit, I find this really intriguing. So you'll see when I go from bar 5 what I'm going to go on about. So it's all sorts of things going on at that point. The first point of reference is the trombones, where basically we have, I think actually it's fourth trombone and one tuba at this point, although it is written for two tubas, but I think this particular bit it's fourth trombone. I don't know why I've written two there, but maybe that must be an error. So I'm just going to not bother with that. But basically in octaves, what I find interesting is that there's nothing else playing those notes, so they really do stand out at that point. Like that. And you get that nice elision of that F. Don't forget that's sounding an octave lower. So if you extrapolate that pitch, let me just sort of put it there. We're there. So it's very, very close to that note. So that's possibly why it's in a different timbre. And of course the tuba is the most successful instrument to have with that, because it's in range. We don't have contrabassoon at that point, but it does join here. Notice that the bassoons and the trombones play something completely different, and it's really interesting here because we've got an F, we've got an A, we've then got another F, and then another A. We don't have any A here, that's just simple bass line. So when we extrapolate everything and put them into even more of a short score, if we look closely, what's interesting is that in this voice one, just that dyad, those two notes, it's only the tuba that plays the lower sounding note, which is then doubled with the cello, and all four trombones are on the third of the chord, which you might think sort of slightly unbalances things. And I'm interested into why didn't the fourth trombone join the tuba at that point? And I don't know. Is it easier because there's no position change to go from A to B flat than from F to B flat? And it could be, and I'd need to go to the position change sheet for trombones to sort of work that out, because there's actually quite a big leap from the A to the F, and you'll notice that actually here it's the bassoons that play the upper notes of that dyad, the F and the A. So there's actually a huge amount just going along in that one little bit. So we've got bassoons here. So contrabassoon sounds an octave lower, so it's playing the F, which is doubled with the double bass. We've then got the upper voices just in bassoons. Don't forget, it's not horns because they're going to be doing something else. And then when the dyad ceases to become from just an F and an A with that double bass note, so we've got essentially like that in terms of sonority. We're then getting an interesting open position chord. So it's a B flat chord. In fact, B flat minor chord with the D flat there, and it changes at this point. That's where the horns come in there. So we've got this typical root fifth third type of idea. Root fifth third. I mean, in terms of what it would normally be, of course, in this instance, is the third root fifth. But you see what I mean in terms of how it's usually sounded. Usually, you get that sort of configuration. I'll just sort of show it to you. So if it was just a root position chord, it would be that. So root fifth third. But basically, it's an open position sound like that. So it's an interesting blend, because in here we've got, I hate when that happens. We've got contra, we've then got tuba, we've then got these trombones, and really we need to sort of keep having a look to see what's going on here. And it can be quite awkward to sort of separate out what's going on. So in terms of how things are voiced, so that's what we're looking for. Boom, boom, boom. Yeah, so basically it will be trombones 1 and 2, 3 and 4, and then tuba, basically, with just one of the trombones there, so it joins at this point. And then it divides into a 4-note chord here, where you get a bit of a space. So trombones tend to be slightly more spaced out, but of course they're not here. Here they're very close, but then they open at that point. And with the combination of bassoons, which are doing something completely different because they're in the top voices, there is a certain amount of blend as well. So the woodwind does blend with the horn, with the trombones and tuba at that point. The VCDB default is just that, exactly, just an octave lower than whatever the cello's doing. And of course there's no other bass note that's getting in the way between this space and that space. There's nothing else getting in the way. So D flats, D naturals, which is an interesting chord, which is B flat with the flat 6 and D because of the Fs there as well, which I haven't shown. And then when they finally culminate at that point, we've got interesting things. So here the tuba is doubling the contrabassoon. We've then got the third trombone at that point, which is an octave higher. And then we've got the bassoons also doubling the trombones at that point as well. So there's nothing else filling in this texture because we've got contra bassoons, but we've also got the availability of another trombone, so it's taking that note, and again that's doubled with the cello. So it's a sort of sensible thing. The horns, interestingly enough, are then tuning themselves to the tubas an octave higher, which can be a little bit awkward in terms of how those are tuned. But we get this really effective sort of mixture of dyads to triads to 4-note chords to essentially then almost 5-note chords. Yeah, and interestingly enough, notice that timpani at this register, there's nothing else in that register at all, in fact. So it does have a sort of interesting prominence, which I find intriguing. So well done, Al Woodbury, for this. Yeah, and it's a nice little sort of swell as well, actually, because we've got little bits of cymbal roll, very soft sticks, and then we've got this interesting harps arpeggiated movement, which is a really interesting chord at that point, which I haven't even bothered to do, but basically a B flat harmonic major chord. It sounds E flat to me, to be perfectly honest, so I don't know whether that's accurate or not. So with a flat 6. And then we've also got a sharp 4 as well. So it's sort of an interesting sort of conglomeration of all of the those flutes and celeste and things. And it's at that point where the flute, I think, and the celeste are playing exactly the same thing. This bit. Like that. As a sort of dying away type sort of idea. This sort of idea of starfall, which I think is interesting. Notice the massive wide space between the contrabassoon and the two bassoons at the top. So yeah, just that chord is a really intriguing one. So at the top, I'm not doing the absolutely everything, but just sort of trying to hone in on some of the brass ideas. So we've got those trombones 1 and bassoon 1 blending, bassoon 2 and trombone 2 blending, trombone 3, and then tubas and contra. So let's put that in. Bassoon 1, trombone 1, bassoon 2, trombone 2, trombone 3, and it could be even with 4 as well, and then tuba and contra as well, and that's what we've got. Let's try and do that. And that's the level of detail that I'm going into. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to shorten the video slightly on this one so that I can then finish the rest of this, because I'm going to go into some strings. But of course I need to reduce it. So we'll make it a sort of shorter video at this point, and then I'll show you the rest of what I'm doing. But basically I just wanted to show you how I might go about, you know, having a look at how this all works, you know, how it's all put together, what's voiced where, why are certain notes doubled and others not, you know, certain notes are blended, certain other notes are not blended. It all seems, dare I say, it's slightly arbitrary, but it can't be. It must be to do with colour and blend, and getting the best results sonically from those instruments. And they're all in sort of really reasonable ranges as well. But I do find this sort of thing where you've got bassoons at the top, because of course I could imagine on a score, you know, all you're going to get on that score is going to be that. So I'm interested in how that has then become this, with this an octave lower, with that an octave higher. So where the tuba is not the lowest sounding instrument, but the contrabassoon is, and it's very dark. In fact, it's very rare to have contrabassoon at that low in Star Wars. Interestingly, it tends to be slightly higher, and actually, interestingly enough, he tends to write slightly higher contrabassoon parts than you might sort of otherwise have thought, just because it's extremely dark at that point, and it can sort of be quite overpowering as well. But anyway, sort of an interesting sort of way that you always imagine that actually tuba might be lower than the contrabassoon, but it's not always the case at all. In fact, in this instance, the tuba is playing an octave higher. Then we've got the A at that point with all trombones, and then they all sort of cascade into their triad at that point. And, you know, individually, everything else makes sense as well. So I like that too. So we get the effect of the harmony in every group, which is a type of orchestral blend rather than the differentiation that we're kind of quite used to with John Williams. So anyway, I'm going to leave it there for the time being. Then I will come back to that and do a sort of proper one. Yeah, hope that you found that interesting. Little bit of discussion, and I will see you again soon.